3 years ago, I stood in this pulpit and I shared with you that in the first 5 months of my retirement, I read Michelle Alexander's book, The New Jim Crow, Mass Incarceration in the Age of Colorblindness. As many of you know, the book is a damning indictment of the criminal justice system in the United States. Alexander describes in her book the history of racialized social control in our country, the structure of mass incarceration, and the role of race in the criminal justice system. She describes how a system which can appear on its face to be racially neutral can manage to round up, arrest, and imprison a disproportionate number of African American men. How this new criminal justice system then operates upon their release from prison to totally disenfranchise these men and create a new caste of untouchables who have almost no civil rights. Today I'm going to pick up my story, and I'm going to share my journey and transformation over the past 4 years since first reading Alexander's book. I'm going to talk about the creation of several projects that I have become involved in during this journey and some of the people that I've met along the way. And what a journey it has been. Because it revolves around issues of racial justice and mass incarceration, I want to provide a context for what follows and what I've been doing for the last 4 years. Alexander tells us that at the start of the war on drugs in the 1970s, there were approximately 300,000 people incarcerated in all of the prisons and jails in the United States. Today, there are over 2 million. We in the United States imprison a larger percentage of our population than any other nation in the world. And I want to repeat this. We in the United States imprison a larger percentage of our population than any other nation in the world. More than 60% of the people in our prisons are racial and ethnic minorities. And Iowa, our home, turns out is one of the worst states in terms of disproportionate incarceration of people of color. African Americans in Iowa make up about 3% of the population. They make up 26% of our prison population. The different treatment in our retributive justice system based on race begins young, and it continues throughout the lifetime for people of color. And Iowa, our state, is the worst or among the worst states in our country in this regard. So, this is the backdrop for the first 4 years of my retirement. My first issue after reading the book was to figure out where and how to focus all of the emotions that had arisen during reading it, the anger, the grief, the energy that was generated. And the issue that I thought I would focus on was voter suppression. Alexander describes this issue in her book, and it was an easy one for me to pick because I have long been outraged by the efforts of politicians of both parties to limit the right of people to vote. And it was also an easy issue because Iowa, as it is in other areas of economic and racial injustice, is worst in the nation. Our Constitution creates a lifetime ban on voting for persons convicted of high crimes and misdemeanors. The only way that a person with felony attached to their name can regain voting rights in Iowa is by an action of the governor upon application by the individual. This means in practical terms that right now, as we sit here today, over 47,000 Iowans are being denied voting rights, as well as other important rights of citizenship. And all of these 47,000 have occurred since Terry Branstad took office because his predecessor granted voting rights back to people who had been convicted of felonies. Most of the people who are barred from voting are poor, and a disproportionate number are African American men. So, I set out to understand better the voting laws in Iowa and to help this group of oppressed people regain their right to vote. Because I had a long-time relationship with an African-American woman who works for the State of Iowa Department of Corrections, I got to interview a group of African-American men who had been granted parole and were at Fort Des Moines in the process of transitioning from prison to civilian life. My friend was leading classes for these men, and she was willing to have me discuss Alexander's book with them. The meeting was a humbling experience. I talked about Alexander's thesis and my hope of helping these men regain lost voting rights. Then I sat back and listened to their responses. I learned very quickly that they had a very different set of priorities. These men, all of whom were African American, were required as a part of their parole to pay a part of the cost of their continued incarceration. They had to find employment. They had to find transportation to get to that employment, sometimes without driver's licenses and frequently without driver's licenses, and certainly with no money. Failing to fulfill these requirements could mean that they could be returned to prison without any effective appeal. And so while voting was not unimportant to them, it certainly was not their first priority. So I had to step back. I had to think about what it might realistically mean for me to actually be an ally to this oppressed group, all of whom now had felon attached to their names. In order to do this, I had to set aside preconceived notions of what might be helpful, particularly to a group of people who, as James Baldwin pointed out, are considered disposable by our society. In this process of discernment, I was fortunate. During the fall of 2013, a coalition was forming to research racial profiling in the state of Iowa. The coalition included Amos, the NAACP, the ACLU of Iowa, the Drake Legal Clinic, and a group of volunteers. The coalition was formed because of the almost total disconnect between statements by public officials and statements by people of color. Public officials, including police, consistently at this time denied the existence of racial profiling as a problem. Conversations with people of color almost universally uncovered incidents of being racially profiled. Our job was to collect people's stories. So I began working with this coalition and doing interviews with people who reported that they had been racially profiled. And what I believed at that time in my head is that, in fact, racial profiling was a problem. But I hadn't yet experienced the emotional side of this, and I certainly, as a privileged white professional male, had never been profiled. So when I started, I'd not yet really heard the individual stories of the people who had run across this problem. A story, for example, of a 16-year-old Hispanic youth who had been stopped by the police at 10:30 in the evening on his way home from a job interview at Cobblestone Theater. The stop was based solely upon the fact that he was a young male of color, driving a nice car in a white neighborhood. I got to hear and emotionally experience the anger, the anguish, and the fear of that young man who had not violated any law and yet was stopped and had both his vehicle and his person searched without justification and without consent. I got to experience the emotions of his mother, who was afraid because her son was not home before 12:30 that night, only to learn later that the police would not let him call her during the stop. One of many mothers I've now listened to who had the talk with their son about how to relate to police when stopped so as not to get hurt. A talk no mother of a white son even thinks about. I'd not heard Anthony's story. 21-year-old Anthony was driving a Mercedes owned by his sister. He was in a Des Moines high school neighborhood during the daytime with one African-American friend in the car with him. He was not in violation of any traffic law when stopped by the Des Moines police patrol car. That car was quickly joined by two other squad cars. The officer approached and said to Anthony, "This is a nice car for a young man to be driving. the implication being very clear. Anthony and his friend were told to get out of the car, and the officer began an interrogation. Anthony and his friend were placed up against the car, in the position, and the officer then began a personal search, again without receiving permission. The car was searched without permission. Nothing illegal was found, and yet Anthony and his friend were questioned about drugs and their lifestyle. At the end of about an hour, no warnings, tickets, or citations were issued, and Anthony and his friend were told to leave. Anthony reports he's pulled over all the time. No illegal substance or contraband has ever been found, and he has never been arrested or charged with any crime. I had not yet heard these and the more than 50 stories that we have collected from our interviews as a part of the racial profiling project. All of them involve a pretextual stop by the police of a person of color and the humiliation of a search of their person and their vehicle. None of the stories that we published in a report that was released last October involve the discovery of contraband, and none involve any arrest or charges of any kind. The project has led to the drafting and filing with the 2016 legislature of a comprehensive statute that will, if adopted, ban racial profiling in Iowa, Iowa being only one of 19 remaining states that does not ban racial profiling. We estimate that it may take 2 to 4 years, if at all, to get this ban passed. My journey has also led me back into the arena of juvenile justice, which is something I did when I practiced law, and programs that were initiated by Amos. It appeared to our Amos working group that if we could help young people in the middle school to resolve their differences without resorting to actions that would lead them into school suspensions, expulsions, and ultimately into the juvenile court system, that there could be both a short-term and a long-term benefit both to the young people and to society in general. And this is because the system works like this. If a young person is removed from a classroom, receives a suspension or expulsion from a public school, that action becomes a permanent part of that child's school record. If the child is later detained and referred to the juvenile justice system, the people who make a determination about possible outcomes for that child have access to the child's school records. Thus, a child who has gotten a cumulative record of being in trouble starts with already 2 or 3 strikes against them. And it is no surprise that the group most harmed by this are young people of color. Disproportionality exists in the public school system as well. The first program, called Let's Talk, started in January of 2014 and is now in 6 middle schools in Des Moines. With the assistance of the Iowa Mediation Service, we have trained over 60 volunteers in mediation techniques to be used with middle school children. Once the mediators are at the school, the young people who have been involved in the problem or the conflict meet with the 2 mediators, and they all talk. The idea being that the young people get to talk to each other. The mediators are primarily older and retired. We provide a safe setting within the school where the youth who are in trouble have an opportunity to talk with each other for as long as it takes and to work through the problem that has brought them into the mediation setting. And while we don't yet have hard data, statistics, on the program, we do have consistently positive reports from the administration and staff of the schools where we operate the Let's Talk program. We also have, perhaps more enjoyably, reports from the one like a girl that I saw, who at the close of our mediation was so taken by the process that she told me that she wanted to do it again in a week with 4 others of her friends with whom she was having problems. Needless to say, we assured her that we were not going to become her personal mediators. At Hyatt Middle School, the process has involved a major commitment by the school administration and a series of trainings on restorative justice and circle principles that have literally involved everyone on the administration and teaching staff of that school. The initial training was so successful that teachers at Hyatt have asked facilitators to come take the process directly into the classroom. This happened 3 weeks ago when 2 facilitators, at the invitation of a very desperate teacher who had been sent bawling from her classroom, took over a classroom for 1 week. By the end of the week, the young people, some of whom did not want to participate, and some of whom who had been bullies and disruptive in the classroom, were now eagerly wanting the facilitators to return for another week. This last Friday, 13 of us went and met with every 6th grade or 7th grade, and now I've forgotten which class it was even, in that school, to introduce them as young people to the circle process, the hope ultimately being that we will create mediators out of these young people and that they will in fact become the circle keepers. The second program that I want to talk about is the Des Moines Police Department Second Chance Diversion Program. This is an existing program that is run by the Des Moines Police Department that offers juveniles who have been detained for a criminal act an opportunity to complete a 6-month informal probation program that is carried out totally within the police department. If the juvenile successfully completes the program, they are not referred to the juvenile court for their offense, and there is no public record of their brush with the law. This is a big deal for a young person, even if they don't yet understand that. In the summer and fall of 2015, Amos and the police department set up a companion program to provide mediation, victim offender conferencing, and restorative circles to young people that were referred by the police department. I want to describe one case from last fall, the first cohort of young people that we got to actually work with. The young person who was referred to us was guilty of shoplifting. The facilitator did an initial review in the case and determined that a conference that included the victim of the shoplifting, the offender, and the offender's family might be useful, and this arrangement was made. During the meeting, the victim got to describe to this young woman the impact that shoplifting has on the store. He also got to learn about the family and circumstances of this young woman. The young woman expressed remorse and acknowledged the wrongdoing. Because the diversion program requires 40 hours of community service as a part of its actions, the store manager and the young woman and family agreed that the youth would work at the victim's store. By the end of the community service hours, a relationship had developed between the victim and this young woman. The relationship was such that the store manager agreed to provide references for her and provide the possibility of future employment at the store as she became available to do that. Imagine, if you will, the difference between this outcome and one in which the juvenile was incarcerated and ended up with a public record of a violation that would stay with her for the balance of her lifetime. Remember in this regard that studies demonstrate that an incarceration or a holding for as little as 24 hours will increase the probability by 70% that that young person, that juvenile, one of our children, will once again within a year be engaged in the juvenile justice system. So this is the kind of transformative work that my friends and I are doing and that I want this church to become more and more involved in. As a part of this, our church is holding a circle process training for church members on April 23rd and 24th, which is a Saturday and a Sunday afternoon. If you're interested in becoming a part of this work, talk with Reverend Aaron, with me, or with Linda Bacon. And one of us will be sitting out at a table out there after the service. If you're interested, the teacher for this training is going to be Kay Pranis. And if you talk with those of us who have been through training with her, you will find out that we all think she's wonderful. Alexander, in her book, has held up a mirror to show the evil that she refers to as the new Jim Crow, our systematic incarceration of poor men and women, and particularly poor men and women of color, and black men in particular. The work of the coalitions that I am now a part of demonstrate ways in which we can engage in this wonderful and painful work. It also shows the need for us individually and as a church community to give up many of our biases and fears that support this system, and as a congregation to embrace what we claim as our core Unitarian principles. I have one more story to share before I close, and it's a very personal reflection. When it came time to work with the second cohort of juveniles in the diversion program, and they come in groups of 12 to 14, we learned that the Amos program had been embedded into the Des Moines Police Department diversion program rather than being kept and treated as a freestanding but parallel program. When this was discussed at the Amos planning meeting concerning the diversion program, an African American woman that I have come to admire, to respect, to trust, and to love exploded in anger. Because of her life experiences, she knew that the white power structure, the police in this case, had once again made promises to people of color with no intention of keeping those promises. 4 years ago, I would have dismissed her anger out of hand. But my life is different now. Because of the work that I've been doing in these last years and the personal relationships that I have developed, including a deep relationship with this woman and her family, because of her willingness to share her story and her family's story about the reality of being black in Iowa, dismissing her reactions was simply not possible any longer. I understand now why she believed as she did, and I understand here as well as here. I also believe something I could not possibly have known 4 years ago, that had my life experiences been the same as hers, had I been raised as an African American child and been an African American man instead of a privileged white professional, my reactions would have been the same as hers. When I retired from my law practice in 2011, I didn't anticipate becoming an activist on racial justice issues. Alexander's book changed all of that. Over the last 4 years, I've been privileged to become a part of a long overdue movement in our country to address the continuing problems of racial disparity and racial injustice. I've been honored to be invited by my African American colleagues and friends into a community of people who had no particular reason to trust me or to share the stories of their lives with me. The work that I'm now doing as an ally and as an advocate would not have been possible without the willingness of these people to accept me as an ally and to share their personal stories with me and to work together. I will be forever grateful. I fully understand that racial justice is not the only compelling issue in our time. There are many critical issues that demand the full and complete participation of every person living in this privileged country. But for whatever reason, the need for systemic change in our retributive justice system is what has engaged my heart as well as my mind. I consider it to be my life's work. And I believe that the clear vision of Baldwin, expressed in the letter to his nephew, must be followed by the equally clear call conveyed in this excerpt from the Ware Lecture given at the 1966 Unitarian Universalist General Assembly by Dr. Martin Luther King, Jr. He said, "Let nobody give you the impression that the problem of racial injustice will work itself out. Let nobody give you the impression that only time will solve this problem. This is a myth. And it is a myth because time is neutral. It can be used either constructively or destructively. And I'm absolutely convinced that the people of ill will in our nation, the extreme rightists, the forces committed to negative ends, have used time much more effectively than the people of goodwill. It may well be that we will have to repent in this generation, not merely for the vitriolic works and the violent actions of the bad people who bomb a church in Birmingham or shoot down a civil rights worker in Selma, but for the appalling silence and indifference of the good people who sit around and say, wait on time. Somewhere, we must come to see that human progress never rolls in on wheels of inevitability. It comes through the tireless efforts and the persistent work of dedicated individuals. Without this hard work, time becomes an ally of primitive forces of social stagnation. So we must help time and realize that the time is always right to do right. I invite you all to join in this good work.